Hey folks, Ariel over here at Fineth, where today I want to do a little update about the financial aspect of my tiny house. I have covered this in some depth over the first several years that I lived in here, and since I actually have it all paid off and have been busy the last few years, I think it's been like 5 years or something since I've touched on this at all. So I thought it was time for an update on how did the finances actually of purchasing a tiny house and living in it actually work out for me. Now, if you're new here, welcome. It's lovely to have you. If you have other questions about the tiny house in general, check out the 600 something other videos or the hundreds of blog posts, or follow Life on MeWe or whatever you want to do. There's lots of other info about life here. This video is specifically about the financial side of things. So I had gone into some depth on this, like I said previously, and I figured some of those people might be wondering how it ended up working out in the longer run. Now, I did not build my own tiny house. I think people who build their own are super amazing. But if you recall my discussion of why I ended up moving into one, which was basically a about to be homeless crisis with losing a rental I had previously been in, the situation didn't allow me the time to do something like build my own, so I was looking for someone to build one for me. Now, like most things in life, forget who originally said it, but you can have something done fast, well, or cheap. Pick any two. I went for the fast and well, and that was not exactly cheap. And so I ended up with a loan to purchase Fineth here. And I was able to do that because the builder was RVIA certified, which is the recreational vehicle something or other. I forget what the letters stand for. So as far as the bank is concerned, this is an RV. And that allowed them to do an RV loan for it. Now, I think a lot more builders now have done a certification like that. As far as anything else in my life, having the RV certification has not been meaningful or useful in any way, other than allowing me to get a loan for it, which was kind of a big deal at that point in time. So that's something to think about if you're looking at options for how to finance. If the builder is certified as an RV manufacturer, then generally a bank will do a RV loan, and they don't care that it looks like a tiny house. You don't even need to say tiny house. It just says RV, it's got a sticker on it, it's got a VIN number, etc. And as far as they're concerned, they're loaning on an RV. I also found that a lot of more traditional banks, at least at that time, were very hesitant to do loans like that. Nobody had heard of tiny houses, and the bank I'd been banking at years, apparently the only way they would do an RV loan was like an 18-month loan with 40% down or something. So that didn't work out for me. I ended up working with a credit union. In my experience, credit unions have been much more open to working with slightly non-traditional things. And so that's another thing to be aware of and consider if you are looking at doing something like this. If your bank won't work with you, possibly look into a credit union. Anyway, I spent a good bit of money on this house, getting it all built, and it has been very solid. You can see how it's held up over the years, and even in my, somewhat harsh climate, and I have no regrets at all about doing it. But all total, it cost me right around $90,000. The majority of that went to the builder for materials and labor, and then a little bit of that was the shipping or transportation for them to haul the house from Colorado, where it was built, to Wyoming, where I lived. And then the rest was paying sales tax to the DMV, because as far as the DMV is concerned, this is also an RV, so there's a significant thousands of dollars went there as sales tax for that. And then the couple other things that I installed, like putting in the wood stove, which was something I did a year after I got the house, and installing my own little solar setup, battery bank, all of that stuff had some expense. But anyway, it rounded out to right around $90,000 total. Now, a lot of people, especially at that time, were like, that's crazy. You're insane. There's, you just basically bought, a vehicle for that price. Not to mention lots of people do buy vehicles at that price, which generally does seem rather insane to me. It's not going to appreciate like a regular house, and so that was just a waste of money. That will never work out financially. Now, I am not a financial advisor, I'm not a banker, none of that. All I can tell you is how it has worked out for me and why it may or may not make any sense for you. I think the first thing you have to figure out, if you're looking at it from a financial aspect and not just my dream is to live in a tiny house no matter what it costs kind of thing, is what would your next option be? What would you be doing if you didn't live in a tiny house, and how much would that cost? If you can buy a little 2-3 bedroom farmhouse on 10 acres for $40,000 in your area, then probably doing a tiny house on wheels like this does not make any sense for you. I was not in that kind of situation. I had been for, I had rented in the same general area for almost 7 years before moving into my tiny house, and rent prices changed and the living situations changed and how many roommates I had and so on. All made that go up and down somewhat, but I had spent basically $90,000 in those previous years on rent, and it got me a place to live. Rent is very high in that area. It has only gotten higher since, but I already spent that much in the time I lived there, and when I moved out of my last rental, what I got for that was a place to live for those years, but nothing else. Whereas if I, spent that same amount of time in the tiny house over 6 years, and now I've been here, I'm in my 8th year, even if the rent had stayed the same, I would have now gotten to live for free for 2 years, and I still have this house, which I can keep living in for a very, very long time. I could sell, I could rent, I could burn it down and come out one bonfire ahead of having rented all that time, and so on. Hopefully the math here makes sense. Since moving into here, rent in the same area where I continued to live until this spring had gone up exceedingly. The closest comparable rental I could find to living in here was there was one place that had small cabins. It was kind of little, I don't know, development, subdivision of them. They have trees and stuff between them, so there was some privacy. They were slightly larger than this. They were about 400 square feet. My tiny house is 160 to 200 square feet, depending on how you count the loft space. So a little bit bigger, but of course with a lot less privacy and space than I had in that clearing where I was living. And they were renting, last time I saw one available, which was a couple years ago, they're usually booked solid. I tried to look it up just before doing this video. There are none for rent right now, so I don't know what the current rental rate is, but it was the most comparable living situation I could have found in the area to what I've had for all these years. And last I saw a price, they were renting for $1,875 a month. So if you do the math on that and divide $90,000 by $1,875, that comes out to, in 4 years of paying that, I would have paid for the whole tiny house, which would then mean at this point, basically, I have lived for free for 4 years, and of course I still have the structure, like I said, to do whatever I want with. So for me, in my area, it worked out to make a ton of financial sense. It's probably the best financial decision I'd ever made. And of course, I could have also possibly purchased a house, theoretically. But again, to stay in that area, I think last time I saw the median house price of anything that was sold in the area was $3.2 million. There's no way I could pay a mortgage on something like that. About the time, it's of course continued to go up over the years, about the time I bought this, on the same road I was living in, what do they call it, a condo sold. It was like a 1-bedroom condo. It had a little more space than this, but you owned only the building. You didn't own the land under it, nothing else. And it sold for $800,000, I think, within the same year that I spent $90,000 to buy this. So that was what I was working with in my area. Now, had I chosen to move to a less expensive part of the country, there would, of course, have been other options. And again, like I said, you got to look at, in your area and where you live, what is available, what would a mortgage cost you, what would rent cost you, and what would a tiny house cost you. And if you're just looking at the finances side of things, figure out if it makes sense for you. In some areas, it would not. For me, it very, very much did. And I got, the loan from the credit union. They did as a 15-year RV loan, which made my payment very relatively low. I was paying, I think, $564 or something was my set monthly payment. If I had paid that, it would have taken me 15 years to pay off. And I knew that, for one, I didn't want to be indebted to anybody for nearly that long. I had no debt before buying this, and I'm back to having no debt. And two, you end up spending a good bit of interest over that time period, which is fair. Somebody else was taking money that I didn't have and allowing me to use it, and so they should make a return on that. But the quicker I paid it off, the less interest I would pay. And the credit union had a really handy setup where there was no penalties or anything for early payment. So every month I could make my regular payment that I needed to make, and a certain amount of that went to interest, and then I could make as many extra payments as I wanted. So for the first almost 5 years, which is, it took me within a few weeks of exactly 5 years to pay that off rather than 15, I would, buy my groceries, buy the gas I needed to get to and from work, the very basic expenses, and every other single penny went into paying this down. I'd make my set monthly payment. If I had an extra $50, I'd pay that off. 2 days later, if I had an extra $25, I'd put that to it. At the end of the week, if I had an extra $100, I'd put that onto it. Every single time I had an extra cent, I put it to paying down the house. And I was working multiple jobs at the time. I was working sometimes double shifts at a waitressing at a restaurant, working 16 hours. I was picking up odds and ends of snow shoveling, gardening, painting, jobs for people in between working full-time at a restaurant. For a while in there, I did cleaning and property rental management for somebody running a short-term vacation rental. So sometimes I'd work at the restaurant and then I'd go clean a house till 1 or 2 in the morning so that it would be ready for the people showing up the next morning, and so on. Anything I could do to make a little extra cash to put toward paying off this loan as fast as I can. And because I paid it in 5 years instead of 15. You can run all of those numbers through a mortgage calculator. My interest rate was 4.7%, which was higher than an average house attached to land loan, but was a decent rate for a RV loan at the time, which is of course what the bank was looking at. Is I saved almost $20,000 by paying it off 10 years early. For me and my amount of income, $20,000 is substantial. So that's something to be aware of, whether you're, even if you're buying a traditional house with a 15, 20, 25, 30-year mortgage, every extra penny you can put down toward paying it off saves you a lot of interest over time. So that worked out well for me, and once it was paid off, like I said, that took me almost exactly 5 years. And so since then, as far as housing, I've been able to live for almost free because I own it. There's a little bit of ongoing maintenance. I've had to replace the water pump a few times. You guys have seen a video of that. 1 or 2 solar system components. And I don't think there's any other maintenance of actually, well, I repainted the exterior this past spring, or restained it. That's really the only maintenance I've had. So having put in that work and effort and blood, sweat, and tears to do that, to acquire something, be able to pay it off, now it has allowed me to have a much greater amount of time flexibility, because I have greater financial flexibility to do other things like make videos for you guys. So this is a basic, math calculation, unless, like I said, you're looking at, I just want to live in a tiny house, I don't care how much it costs, that's my dream, which is fine. But if you're looking at the financial side of it, you got to figure out what would you spend in rent, or what would you spend on a mortgage, and don't forget to take the interest into account, because that's substantial. That's something a lot of people just don't think about. I'm sure some of you are quite aware of, but if you buy a $200,000 house with a 30-year mortgage, you're going to spend almost $500,000 by the time you pay that thing off. And so that's substantial. So figure out what your other housing options would cost, and then figure out what a tiny house would cost, and then basically see how it adds up. Oh, buying a house with a little mortgage out here in the country, that'd be way cheaper, so why would I buy a tiny house? Or, nope, that would cost me millions, and I could buy a tiny house for this price, so this makes more sense. That's going to be different for each of you, depending where you live and what the prices are, and so on. This is how it worked out for me. It has been wonderful, and like I said, of course, now I have the house. I don't have any intention of ever selling it, but I could, and there's pretty decent market for secondhand tiny houses at this point. Tinyhouselistings.com, I think, is the best place to find them. You can find all kinds of qualities and stages of builds and locations and stuff where you can find secondhand ones. I've seen some very nice ones on there over the years, and the nice ones usually sell pretty quickly. So that would be an option. I could recoup at least some of the money I spent if I wanted to sell the tiny house now. So the other thing I want to address with that is that people will often say, oh, it's a dumb financial investment because if you bought a real house attached to the ground, it would be real estate and, it would appreciate over time. In general, that has happened. Of course, anybody who went through 2008 knows that that doesn't always happen. Sometimes it goes down. But one thing I'd like to address that I think is a common misconception, and there are financial experts who disagree with me on this, and there are financial experts who definitely agree, but look it up yourself, figure this out. A house that you live in is... Well, let's talk for a second. On a financial balance sheet, you have things generally that are assets. There are things that bring you money or whatever, and there are liabilities, things that cost you money. That's pretty much the two sides of things. And a lot of people think the house they live in is their biggest asset. For most people, and I'll put some links to this stuff down below if you don't believe me, there are some very big name financial advisors who very much agree with this. If it's a house you're living in, it is not generally a financial asset. It is generally a liability. You're spending mortgage payments, interest payments, maintenance payments, etc. It is costing you money regularly to maintain that thing. That is what you call a liability. Now, if you own a rental and it is regularly bringing in income because someone else is living in it and paying you money, that could be an asset. But in general, the house you're living in is a liability, unless you figure out how to do something else profitable from it, like turn it from just a house into a little homestead or a business, or where you're, selling extra veggies or eggs or beef, or running a sewing business out of it, or a mechanic business or something else. There are certainly ways to turn a house you live in into something that produces income rather than just takes income. But if you're doing the traditional, you live in a nice big house somewhere in America anyway, and it regularly costs you this and this and this and this to keep it maintained and running, that's a liability. That's not an asset. So as far as the people who said, oh, it's going to be dumb financially because it's not going to appreciate, that hasn't, they're not necessarily wrong that it has not appreciated. Well, actually, given lumber's and material prices in this last year, there's a chance I could sell this for what I paid for it or even more. But like I said, I'm not planning to sell it. But anyway, in general, it would cost less over time. But obviously, we all tend to purchase things that don't appreciate because we value something we get from them now. A lot of people drive a vehicle. That obviously has ongoing maintenance, insurance, gasoline, etc. costs. So that is a liability, and generally vehicles get worth less over time. Again, except for the last couple of years when secondhand vehicles have gotten more expensive than they were several years ago. But in general, they do depreciate. And you still probably choose to drive a vehicle because you enjoy the benefits that it's giving you now, even though it will be worth less money later. Or you may go buy a cup of coffee this morning, not because you think in a year that cup of coffee will have appreciated and bring you more money, but because there's something you value about drinking that cup of coffee today. So for me, the house was like that. It provided me something I have valued now, and for 8 years now, a place to live, a warm, cozy spot to have my stuff, be out of the weather, sleep, eat, all of that. And so it's provided me great value. It would have cost me more to live in my same area and acquire those same benefits of a place to live in any other way, either renting or purchasing a house attached to the ground. And so financially, it's just worked out really, really well. And again, that doesn't mean it's going to in your area. You got to do that math for your situation and what your other options would be that you would consider living in and what they would cost and what a tiny house would cost and so on. But for me, it has worked out really well. As I said, at 2 years old, rental prices in the area, the amount I spent on the tiny house, I would have spent in rent in 4 years. I have been in here for 8 years. That would have given me, if you want to figure that out, it would have given me, having spent the same amount in 4 years, lived for free for 4 years, and now I still have a house. And like I said, even if I wanted to just burn it down today, I'd be one big bonfire ahead of plus 4 years of having, rented something the whole time, and with my income, purchasing something in that area wasn't even an option. There's no way I could have even got a mortgage for anything in the price range that properties sell for there. So for me, it has worked out very well. And if you're in a similar situation, I think it could possibly be a very good financial decision for you as well. And then obviously we've gotten other benefits, like Clay and I got together, we bought this property that we're now on in this, past year, and the spring moved the tiny house onto it, and we, in addition to all those other benefits, had an instant house that, yeah, it's not real big for 2 people, but we had an instant place where you could sleep, eat, cook, sit, be comfortable, warm, out of the weather, you know, and so on. And so already having owned that was a big plus when we purchased this property. So there are other benefits that have come from it as well. So that's kind of the finance side of things. A few other finance topics that I've gotten questions about over the years. Insurance for a tiny house. I did have insurance on this house. If I can remember, I'll link below. I had done a couple detailed blog posts about that. It was a requirement of the bank loan, which I can understand if something happens to it. They want to be sure their money they have invested is covered. So as long as I had the loan, I was required to have insurance, and I did. I'd found one company I had for a while, and then I was eventually able to find one that gave me a slightly better deal. I don't know how well it would have worked had I ever needed to make a claim. I never needed to make one, and the day I paid off the house, I canceled the insurance policy because the only reason I had it was because it was a requirement of the bank loan. In general, I prefer to just save my own cash and insure myself, if you want to think about it that way, by having enough savings to deal with unexpected things as they come up, rather than spending that amount every month for an insurance policy. But I did have it for those first 5 years while I had a loan. Again, that would be a place where having the house listed as built by a certified RV builder was useful. I think there are now a few insurance companies that work with self-built ones if that's important to you. I haven't had to deal with that. I'm not a good person to ask about that, but it is definitely easier to get an insurance policy if, as far as the insurance and bank is concerned, the house is an RV, which is something that sounds familiar. That's one of the things with insurance companies and banks. They just like things that they feel like they know, and so they know what RVs are, and they've been working with them for a very, very long time, many, many decades, and so that's not new and scary. Whereas if you say tiny house, that's sometimes new and scary, much less so now than it was 8 years ago, of course, but it's helpful for those companies to just have something that they feel like they know the risks and benefits of, and so they know how to deal with that. So if you're looking for insurance, that is some thoughts on that. And otherwise, that's why it has worked out financially well for me, and why it may or may not be a great or terrible idea for you, depending on your situation. But hopefully that look back, now that I'm this many years in, on what it cost and how that's worked out is helpful, either in making you decide, nope, that will never ever make sense for me, that's no good, or, oh yes, I can see how that would benefit me. And hopefully that's helpful in making whatever kind of decision you end up doing, if that's what you're looking at. Hopefully you guys all have a wonderful day, and if I miss covering something you've got a question about, ask down below and I'll try to eventually get an answer to you. Over here at Fineth, thank you so much for watching these videos and spending some of your very valuable time choosing to do that. We hope you found something that was useful, educational, helpful, maybe save someone else some time and trouble, or just something just plain beautiful. If you don't want to miss any videos, subscribe and hit the bell. And thanks for coming along on our journey as we build a new little homestead with our tiny house and everything to come.